This is what I'm doing. As part of my PhD, I'm trying to understand what is the place of science and academia within the larger history of human society. A major aspect here is power. Science and academia, after all, are the greatest resources that we have to gain greater power. Just think about it for a second. Beyond the pleasure of learning, what is the purpose of having new knowledge, more knowledge about something? Isn't it to gain greater control over the thing that we know more about? And beyond the fun of creating flashy new toys, creating technologies and tools, what do we do that for? Isn't it to gain greater precision, greater capacity to do things, greater power? So I think that the question of what is the place of science and academia within the larger history of human civilization can be taken as a question of what is the place of science and academia within larger systems, within regimes of power. In other words, what is the place of one system of power within larger structures of power? But which are those systems of power? Where do we place them in history? And what characterizes them? That's what I will try to answer. Now, this whole project will take me several months of study and conceptualization. This is just the first part, so I'll explain to you no more than the first step that I have taken. I started this project realizing the following: that in public discourse, in social media discourse, internet discourse, more than ever before, at least in my experience, words like colonialism, imperialism, neocolonialism, postcolonialism, settler colonialism, all these terms have become incredibly popular. And probably you can already see the connection here with systems and regimes of power. These terms, after all, describe different dimensions of major systems, of major structures of power, of the ways in which states rule over others. But my realization was, I don't really know with any precision what any of these concepts actually mean, but primarily I thought about the two biggest concepts, colonialism and imperialism, and still, the same realization. I have an intuitive understanding of what they may mean, but nothing with too much precision. I don't even know how they differ, they kind of sound like the same thing. So what I want to share with you is what I learned about what they mean and about how they differ. Now, one important point before starting. I think that it is becoming increasingly necessary to do academic research that is in close conversation, in close interaction with internet and social media discourse. And so what I did for this video is that instead of starting by checking the academic literature, I started by checking the YouTube videos that have been done about this topic, and then just checking a little bit of the academic literature on the side. So these are all the videos that I checked for your reference, and the question: what are colonialism and imperialism? How do they differ from each other? What can we learn from these videos? So well, let's get into the answers. And the answer overall is that there is no overall answer. Among all these videos, the most popular ones, only very few of them actually try to define these concepts. And between those who do, well, the agreement is that, well, there's no agreement. So that takes us to the first lesson, that the guys at Crash Course also know very well. When it comes to colonialism and imperialism, well, there are many different definitions for these concepts. Many of those overlap, and there's a still ongoing debate between academics about their precise definitions.
Imperialism and colonialism do have really similar definitions. In fact, they're still debated within geography and other disciplines.
But I cannot just simply take those for answers. The purpose of scholars should be precisely to bring some of that sweet conceptual clarity to a messy and complex debate. And in my attempt at doing so, I can see that there are three clear different definitions, at least. The last one, the most important for my PhD project. So let's get into those. So the first definition, the one most people seem to agree upon, and the most intuitive one, colonialism refers to colonies, and therefore refers to a tool, to a method, to a system for enforcing power over another population. Imperialism refers to empire, and therefore refers to the political mission, to the political project, to the political agenda, to expand the power and control of a state, of an empire. So colonialism, a system, a technique for expanding power; imperialism, the project to expand that power. These are pretty easy to distinguish because these two things belong to two different categories. One a plan, the other one a method. Though you may also notice that some dependency starts to appear here, because it seems like colonialism is the application, the realization of imperialism. But let's just leave it there. Now, just a little parenthesis. Sorry for the totally different setting. I had to move to a different place and I lost the files that I had. So I need to reshoot this part, but let's get it going. So where did we leave this? We left it at the second definition. So now, the second definition. And I think this is where the serious problems start. In the previous definition, we saw that colonialism and imperialism are basically two different types of things. But these words can also be used for the same type of thing, for the same category of things, both describing methods, approaches, systems for enforcing, for enlarging the power of a state. Therefore, obviously, in the second definition, the point with these two concepts is that they help us define the naturally diverse ways in which power can be enacted. We can actually check the video Colonialism from the Geography series by the Crash Course guys, because in this video they really try to get into the differences in the definitions of these two concepts, among other ones. And I really love that they try to do that, but we can see some clear problems. Let's start with this. The video goes into the case of Taiwan as the best example to explain how control over a territory can take so many different shapes, and therefore illustrating the use of these different concepts. Taiwan has been under Dutch, Chinese, and Japanese control, then becoming independent, nonetheless still serving the geopolitical agenda of the USA in Southeast Asia. At some point we're told that the Dutch did colonization in their subjugation of the indigenous people and in their use of Taiwan as a shipping port, while the Qing dynasty did something more like imperialism in their use of Taiwan as a military base, mostly for the purpose of keeping pirates away. The point at the core of these explanations is essential and it is correct. There are very different ways in which a state can exert control over a population or over a territory, but the vocabulary that we're using here may not be the best one. For example, here it is not clear at all why making Taiwan a shipping port is colonialism while making it a military base is imperialism. Didn't both have colonies after all? Does this mean that colonialism is more so about ruling for economic gain while imperialism is more so about ruling for military strategy? And this doesn't seem to fit well with the definitions that the video itself gives at the start. At the start of the video, empires are differentiated from imperialism. Imperialism implying, and let me quote, unequal economic or power relationships, domination and subordination. Obviously these for the purpose of things like acquisition of land, resources, or strategic positions. And then we're told about different types of colonization, which can be either a type of imperialism or just another type of empire. Now, this is confusing, and it is because, again, this is a bit of a conceptual mess. For example, imperialism is framed as like the bad version of an empire. But how can that make any sense? Isn't in the definition of an empire that an empire has to expand, and expansion, doesn't that imply the subordination of other peoples? How else do you expand? How else do you do empire building? And then we're also told that colonialism is a sort of imperialism plus, which I understand as colonialism being the realization of imperialism. But this definition seems very alike to the first definition, and that clashes with what we were told about Taiwan, which is more alike the second definition. In the case of Taiwan, colonialism is not the application of imperialism, it's not imperialism plus. It is just a different way of doing power. One was power for trade and economic gain, and the other one was power for military strategy. And then, before any clarifications, we're introduced to even more concepts, like the word settler colonialism or the word economic colonizing force to describe Japan's rule over Taiwan. Now, again, this is indeed messy, and just saying that definitions are still debated or that they can sometimes overlap, those are really not satisfying answers. Now, just to make my point very clear, all these different concepts and terms, colonialism, imperialism, settler colonialism, neocolonialism, neo-imperialism, economic colonialism, military colonialism, I think that all these different terms are pretty terrible at describing the things that they're trying to describe. Because, again, these words are supposed to describe the different ways in which interstate power relationships can happen. But the things that they actually describe, colonies, settlements, military action, economic gain, all of these things happen in most instances of interstate power relationships. They don't really describe anything unique to any one of these different cases. It is not very illuminating to say that something is imperialism and not colonialism, as if imperialism didn't imply to some extent the presence of colonies. And it is not very illuminating to say that something is economic colonialism, as if that didn't require some extent, some way of military power. Or, as an additional example, for the average person, it's not very illuminating to say that something is settler colonialism, because settlements and colonies, they kind of sound like the same thing. So, again, my conclusion here is that we do need a diverse vocabulary to describe these different types of interstate power relationships, especially when they imply subordination. But I really don't think that the vocabulary that we have now is actually any good. So I do really think that scholars need to do a better job at offering people a better vocabulary. Though maybe the problem is that, I'm just checking YouTube videos. So probably these YouTubers need to do a better work informing themselves. Although maybe what that actually means is that scholars need to go out and communicate with, a wider audience on the internet. And now, the third and last definition, which is actually the one that I am looking for my PhD project. And surprisingly, this is one that is overlooked in all of the videos that I watched. A question that is very important to ask is, how do we identify, how do we characterize, how do we talk about different historical periods, different historical paradigms of interstate power relationships? And I'm very surprised that this question is not often addressed because it does make a lot of sense to ask it. We talk about periods of times and eras for a lot of things. Shouldn't we also do that with the ways in which, states have dominated other peoples and territories? And this is actually funny, this is actually interesting, because while none of these videos acknowledge the existence of different periods, different eras of interstate power relationships, they do notice that most people often think about and often refer to one of these specific periods. And I say this because in a lot of these videos, it is acknowledged that for most people, not only average people, but also for scholars, in most of the times when they talk about colonialism, they refer to a specific period in time. They refer to that period between the 16th century and World War II, where mostly major European powers took over the whole world. Of course, with the USA and Japan joining later into the party. Now, this obviously tells us that to most people's impressions, and also to scholars' impressions, there is an identifiable period of time with a beginning and an end in which interstate power relationships were done in a certain way. There was a paradigm of power, and we usually call that one colonialism. I guess we can talk about the colonial era. But just noticing this opens up a very big but very important question. If this period of time is the era of colonialism, then what exactly was the era that was there before that? And what was the era that came after? What is the era of interstate power relationships in which we live on? Now, just a small note here. I know that when it comes to talk about the period of time that came before the colonial era, we have the word post-colonialism as an option. But again, my core point in this video is that most of our vocabulary to talk about these interstate power relationships is pretty bad, and post-colonialism is also a pretty terrible word. Because number one, calling things post really does not describe that much, apart from the obvious fact that something came after something else. Now, I know that there's an important historical background and an element of historical recognition there, but we can do better. And second, for a lot of people, probably the word post-colonialism can be interpreted in such a way in which it expresses that colonialism and therefore these unjust, unequal interstate relationships that they ended were in the post-era, and that's just not true. Now, a different answer to what came after colonialism, and surprise, surprise, is the imperial era or imperialism era. Now, there's this actually very popular entry on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy about colonialism, in which they suggest this idea that after the colonial era, mostly characterized by this thing called colonialism, imperialism was this method of domination and of power that became the new norm. And actually, this is heavily based on Lenin's historical analysis and analysis of power relationships in his time. He puts it all in this funny book. And besides your opinions of Lenin as a political actor, the ideas at the core actually make a lot of sense. Lenin is trying to tell us that there has been a progression, a development in the methods often used to exert power at an international level. And the statement is absolutely true. By the early 20th century, we were living in a world that was heavily and intensely changing. The ways of doing power are not the same anymore. And at least in Lenin's opinion, things like the sophistication of the banking system and finances, this lending of capital between different states, is what comes to define how power is done in the 20th century. Of course, the most important part is that history and how states relate to each other, how this is heavily, intensely changing. This is obviously true after the sophistications of capitalism by the start of the 20th century, and it is even more relevant and poignant and urgent of an observation after World War II. But of course, changes in the economy and the ways of doing finances are not everything that define this new era. But before going further into any sort of explanation, I will just leave it here. Because this idea at the core, something as simple as noticing that, yes, indeed, it seems like there are different identifiable periods of time, different paradigms of how interstate power relationships have occurred. Just noticing these different periods in time is enough for me as a first step. So I will leave it here, because this idea, as simple as it is, the idea that there are different historical periods of interstate power relationships, That's my first step. That's my first clue. My first step into my little project for framing how the Western institutions of academia and science have a place in the larger history of humanity. Now, the problem that we need to solve now is basically that same problem that we saw with the second definition, though framed slightly different. The problem is that, yeah, we may have the intuition and we may have the enlarged, broader historical perception of how, surely, the world and how states relate to each other has incredibly changed through time. But apart from that broad sense and that intuition, do we actually know what precisely characterizes power relationships in the colonial era? Do we actually have good ways of explaining what characterizes power relationships in our times? For example, in the case of our times, it is not just increased technological sophistication in the banking system, in international finances, or things like that that defines our era. What about the role that other dimensions of global society play? What about the role of democracy in our current interstate power relationships? What about the birth of this middle class, highly educated with voting rights? What about our current systems of media, of information, of entertainment? What about the education and higher education system? What about nationalism? What about culture? How do these different socio-technical systems, how do these different sophistications of life shape how power is done at an international level? So again, what are the things that better characterize the colonial era, and what are the things that better characterize the imperial era, for the lack of a better name, sorry? What differentiates one from the other? Now, actually, some definitions often used to make this distinction is that colonialism is all about, or was all about, direct power, while imperialism, and in this imperial era, we see power being done in this sophisticated, indirect way. But that's actually a pretty awful definition that does not describe shit. It should be totally unacceptable for a scholar or an academic to try to differentiate two social phenomena, two phenomena of any kind, just by saying that one is indirect and one is direct. That really does not describe nothing. The only good observation that this definitions actually make is that indeed there is an increased level of sophistication, of technicality, going from colonialism to imperialism. That's pretty important because that obviously goes back to my question of science and academia. It is, after all, the development of new technologies what serves as the basis for making this transition into imperialism. But these are things that we will explore more deeply next time. So, see you then.